Hi everybody, I'm Munz from Bocconi University. This is joint work with my PhD student Shahryar Mohsenin, who's currently visiting Monash University and was unable to make it here today. So when we think about voice assistants, probably the most common ones are the ones you see on the screen here. You think of Alexa, you think of Siri, Google Assistant. One of these things that all of these voice assistants have had in common is when they were first introduced, they were introduced with female voices. So justifiably, the UN and others considered this a problem. The idea here was that voice assistants being predominantly female could reinforce harmful stereotypes. The stereotype that maybe a female is an assistant. So in response to that, many of the voice assistants made other voices available. Like, for example, you can use a male-sounding voice on Google Assistant. But there were other calls for other solutions as well. So a group of researchers in Denmark, for example, raised a call that, hey, these are digital voices. You can make a voice that sounds neither male nor female. And so Apple, with their voice assistant Siri, responded to that call and created one such digital voice, which in 2022 they made available as a voice on their Siri voice assistant. It sounds something like this.
Hi, I'm Siri. My voice was designed to sound neither masculine nor feminine.
Okay, so this is a voice that's available on Siri, and so we had the question, how will consumers respond when it's difficult to understand the gender of the speaker? So while the goals of this are laudable, so they wanted to introduce a voice that doesn't have these harmful stereotypes and potentially introduces a wider audience to a non-binary voice, it's unclear how consumers might respond to this. And we were concerned because there is some reason to believe that consumers might respond negatively. So let's look at how we ask this question here. How do consumers respond when it is difficult to understand the gender of the speaker? When we asked ourselves this question, it sounded to us a lot like a related idea called disfluency. So it's this idea when it's difficult to process information, people generally respond in a negative way to that information. So this has been manipulated in the past using things like fonts, like you see on the screen, compared to when it's easy to read in the bottom, the fluent condition. People reading this top condition, a weekly report on gadgets and gizmos, would have a lower opinion of the information that's reported in that disfluent font. And this has been extended into areas including into the auditory realm. So, for example, when the sound quality of a presentation is low, if for whatever reason the audio equipment used to record the recording isn't great, or if the speakers that it's being played on are not great, people are going to rate that information as less. So that was studied in the context of academic reports like this one. There's also been some work that has looked at accents. So when people with a foreign accent are being listened to, generally the quality of what they're saying is reported to be lower compared to someone without an accent. The authors in this case suggested that it's actually harder to understand what the people are saying, and people misinterpret this difficulty understanding with what they're saying with their evaluation of the information itself. So we were interested in something similar, but could a similar process also apply to difficulty understanding social information? So in the case of a foreign accent, it was difficult to understand what they were actually saying. If it's equally easy to understand what the person is saying, but it's difficult to understand the social information, for example, the gender of the voice, could this lead to a similar feeling of disfluency? So we predicted that it could, and we predicted this for two reasons. The first could be related to categorization. So difficulty categorizing as male or female could be misinterpreted as, this feeling of difficulty could be over-interpreted and interpreted as dislike for what the information that the speaker is saying. In a related vein, lots of work in the area of fluency has also looked at the link with familiarity. So the more familiar information seems to you, the more familiar a stimulus seems to you, the more favorably people tend to rate that. Kind of like a mere exposure effect. And since people encounter more gender-obvious voices in their day-to-day life, they will probably, in most cases, be less familiar with gender-ambiguous voices, and thus they might have a negative reaction to these types of voices. So these are two processes which we think can contribute to what we're calling social disfluency. But of course, it's also possible that people have prejudice. So non-binary voices are more commonly associated with LGBTQ people. And so if people hold prejudice against LGBTQ people, it may be that they're just expressing this bias rather than showing a type of social disfluency like we're arguing. So over the course of, I guess, 6 studies, we provide evidence in favor of this kind of social disfluency account. In the sake of time, because this is a 15-minute presentation, I'm going to talk about just 3 of them. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. But before I do, I guess there is further ado, I would like to mention that for all the studies, the supplementary material, data, pre-registrations, and survey materials are posted on ResearchBox at the link that you see on your screen. Okay, so we wanted to show this effect in an experimental design with the actual voices that we're talking about. So Siri introduced these voices last year, but they also have male and female versions of Siri that's available. So the point of this study was to compare how consumers react to descriptions of consumer products when they're described by either the male Siri, the female Siri, or the ambiguous Siri. So we designed this in a 2x2 design where participants heard descriptions of 2 similar brands of toothpaste, one described by a clearly gendered voice and the other described by the gender-ambiguous voice of Siri, which with the appropriate counterbalancing. And so as our DV, instead of asking about their liking of the speaker, we asked, how much do you like this product? So this is not an inference about the speaker, or how much do you like the voice. Instead, it's a more of an inferential process similar to what we would expect from disfluency, where it should spill over to the evaluation of the product that's being described. We also looked for 2 other possibilities in this study. We checked for a mediating effect of social disfluency. How difficult was it to evaluate the gender of each speaker? And then we also looked for an alternative account, just instead of social disfluency, just looking at more processing disfluency. How difficult was it to evaluate the information provided by each speaker? So our results were consistent with our hypothesis. When products were described by gender-ambiguous speakers, they were liked less than when they were described by clearly gendered speakers. And that happened for when both contrasting the male voice to the ambiguous voice, the 2 bars on the left, and when contrasting the female voice to the gender-ambiguous voice, the 2 bars on the right. And you can see there's a clear main effect of the gender-ambiguous voice as well. Consistent with our theorizing, there was also a mediating effect of social disfluency. So remember, social disfluency was measured by how difficult was it to evaluate the gender of each speaker. People rated the ambiguous voice more difficult to evaluate, and that in turn reduced product judgments. So this partially mediated. Now, to our surprise in this study, we found that that second alternative, just regular processing disfluency, also mediated the effect. And so to deal with that in future studies, we use slightly different stimuli. So you may have noticed that in the last study, we used different voices. So it was 3 different voices that we were comparing. And these may have differed in their paralinguistic cues. So things like intonation, pausing, etc. And we think that those may have contributed to the differences in how easy or difficult it was to understand the speaker. And so in the following studies, we take a different approach. Instead, we use one voice and we manipulate its pitch to be, we take a bass voice and we either raise its pitch by a certain number of semitones to make it more feminine. So in this case, it's a female voice. So we started with a female voice called Sophie. We raised its pitch by, I think, 1.5 or 1 semitone in this case, to make it a more clearly female version of Sophie. And we lowered its pitch by the same amount, 1.5 or 1 semitone, to make it more ambiguous. We brought it down into the range where it's not really clear whether the voice should be male or female. Okay, and so for the sake of completeness, I'll let you listen to those voices now. So this is the female voice of Sophie.
I found a brand new compact and lightweight power drill, Netta.
And this is the gender-ambiguous version of Sophie.
I found a brand new compact and lightweight power drill, Netta.
Okay. So the idea is that particularly that gender-ambiguous voice, we're not really clear what gender it is. In study 4, we're looking for a moderating role. So we proposed 2 different accounts that might explain this social disfluency. And the first was related to categorization. And so in this experiment, we crossed this manipulation, this manipulation of pitch, with a manipulation where we either gave the voices names or not. So in other words, the idea behind this study was if our participants encounter a voice that has a clearly gendered name, they should be less ambiguous about what gender category it belongs in, and that should kill the effect. What we find, in this experiment we used cordless drills as stimuli. So if you notice, our manipulation was to lower the pitch of the female voice to make it more ambiguous. There's existing research that suggests that people prefer gender-consistent categories. So like for a power drill, they should prefer a male voice, one with lower pitch. And so this is a conservative test. In other words, if they prefer a lower-pitched voice in this category, the gender-ambiguous voice should actually be preferred to the gender-neutral voice, or to the clearly gendered voice. But consistent with our predictions for social disfluency, we replicated our effect in the no-name condition. Those are the bars on the left. You can see that the gray bar, the ambiguous condition, was rated worse than the female version of the voice. And inconsistent with this idea of categorization, there was also a significant difference when there were names. And it was in fact directionally bigger. You can see that the interaction is kind of approaching significance in some sense. It's not f less than 1. It was directionally bigger in the name condition, suggesting that it's not even close. Like giving it a name, helping people understand what category the names belong in, was not effective in reducing this effect. So this is evidence against a categorization story, but we're still finding this pattern consistent with social disfluency. In this study, we also measured explicit prejudice, so agreement on 5-point scales with these measures that were adapted from existing literature. And we find that when controlling for existing prejudice in this kind of explicit way, the results are essentially unchanged. And so we conducted one final study that tried to look at this, to try to examine the process that's happening here. Using the same voices of Sophie, we crossed our manipulation of the product narrator, so the narrator describing the product, with a manipulation of the study's instructions. So in the previous experiments, the study's instructions were in writing, people just read them to themselves. Here, we allowed people to listen to either the ambiguous version of Sophie or the female version of Sophie in the introduction. The idea was that this should make them more familiar with the voice and it should diminish the size of the effect. Consistent with our hypotheses, we find a pattern that looks like this, that familiarity is an important moderator. So when they had more exposure to the ambiguous voice, those are the bars on the left, there was no difference between the ambiguous, the product rated in the ambiguous voice and the product rated in the female voice. However, we replicated our effect when the female voice narrated the introduction. They preferred the product that was described in the female voice more so than they preferred the product in the ambiguous voice. Now, also to address prejudice, we look at LGBTQ perception. To what extent do you think each voice of the speaker sounds like a person from the LGBTQ community? And what we find is that both groups perceive the ambiguous voice to be LGBTQ. In other words, there's still a significant difference between the two voices in both conditions. And so that implies that bias could be present in both groups. So recall that 2 slides ago I showed you that the pattern completely attenuated, and here we still see that there is a difference between the groups. So this suggests that bias probably wasn't completely eliminated in this case, but we did completely eliminate the negative effect of the gender-ambiguous voice. So from this, we can conclude that consumers do react negatively to gender-ambiguous voices. This effect is best explained by low familiarity with the voices, and it occurs above and beyond prejudice. The good news, I think, is that increasing exposure to the gender-ambiguous voice is a viable means of reducing the negative response. Okay, thanks for your time.